I'm struggling with the idea of doing good apart from God. I am a current church member in my town, and I love my church. I love God too, just saying. But I have friends in town who are not professing Christians or churchgoers, but they do very charitable acts, volunteering at multiple charities, running events, etc. And I hardly see our own church members helping our community in this way. They may help if it pertains to a church event, maybe. So I really do understand why people think that they don't need church or God to be good when there are others out there doing good works apart from the church and God. How do I reconcile this, though? How do I talk about this to my unbelieving friends? I love this question. Okay, first, let me start with a point that I think this might be more of an ecclesiological issue than a soteriological issue. And what I mean by that is your church has issues, but it doesn't reflect on the doctrine of salvation. Your church leaders probably need to reflect on what it means to love and serve others, to be in the world but not of the world, to be the light of the world, glorifying their Father in heaven by shining their light. And charity is only part of it. And some churches go too far on the other end, where all they do is charitable works, right? But they don't do anything to further the gospel or discipleship. They don't focus on those things. And they don't focus on, good theology or anything like that. I think some churches can get off task in this area because they become rather tribalistic, maybe, where they see everyone else as an outsider and maybe harbor bitterness towards unbelievers. And they need to repent, if I'm honest. Jesus said that we would be known by our love. And what I think is that this has created a rather fearful and overcorrected reaction with some churches because they don't want to risk being lumped in with some progressive churches, right, who have a warped view of love. Now, whatever the reason, I can only guess, if I'm honest, but it's difficult to take any church seriously if they don't reflect charity. So, setting the shortcomings of some churches aside, let me move to your core point. How and why people think that they don't need church or God to be good when there are others out there doing good works apart from going to church and God. First and foremost, I want to say that we don't need church or God to be moral, but I will get more into that in just a second. First, I have to say, I always wonder when it comes to this question, what people's standard of good is. We don't have morals because we believe in God. Goodness is not an invention of mankind. We believe in God because objective morality exists. Not to mention, this is one of the biggest problems I have when I come across Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses, religious people like that in general, secular humanism, or New Agers, or any religion really. What they do is they claim that they have truth because of all the charitable things they do and how much they help and love on other people. And by this standard, all beliefs are true then. All religions are true. This is why Jesus can only be a part of it for a works-based religion. They must do good works because this, according to them, reflects on them as being sincere believers and loving people. I one time had somebody tell me that you don't have to believe in God to be a Mormon. You just got to follow the rules. What they meant by this is that belief, it's there. It's part of it, but it's a backseat issue. It was really how good of a Mormon they were if they did the right works. Even if their beliefs are in error, which they are, they will fall back on good works because this is what makes them look like Jesus, they will say. And it's not just them. It's this mindset in general, right? So Angelina Jolie, for example, she's a humanitarian. And if I'm honest, probably does more charity work than most people. Many celebrities have adopted orphans, donated millions of dollars, and have done many good works. Mr. Beast, the YouTuber, his entire channel is dedicated to helping others in extreme ways and has even promised to give away all his fortune at the end of his life. But there's no way for us to know this, but how is his thought life? What does he struggle with when nobody's watching? The thing is that nobody can know that. Does this mean that all these people are somehow spiritually better off than others? Does this somehow affect how much truth they have based on their good deeds? Does this give a J-dub or an LDS more validity for their beliefs simply because they baked cookies for a stranger, helped at a homeless shelter, and volunteered their weekends for the sake of being selfless? I would say no, it doesn't. But what it does, and this is important, what it does do is it makes them part of God's moral law. This is Romans 1 stuff. So everyone can see what's good, so they do what's good. And in a way, this actually proves God exists because we know what's good. What they're doing, all they're doing is simply reflecting a moral law, a law written on all of our hearts. It reflects that and the fact that as image bearers of God, we want to help and do good things. They think this is what makes them good by their own standards. Human beings typically do. They think they're too good, that people are generally good. And if I'm a good person, why would I look for someone to save me? The other issue is this standard of goodness. Part of this issue, if I can elaborate, is that people think they're good, as I said before, right? But Romans 3 says that no one is good. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. No one is righteous. We all fall short of God's perfect standard. And I think this is where people get tripped up. This is what makes them give a think to the concept of goodness. If I can, let me try to describe this standard. Let's hypothetically say that God has commanded us to jump to Jupiter. This is a measure of your goodness. Jupiter is the absolute most perfect standard of good. If you can jump that high, you are perfect. This is God's standard, and you must meet it in order to gain perfect merit with God. This would simply be an impossible standard. Now, what we do to remedy this is we just simply make our own standard of goodness. If we were to measure the standard of good to, say, like a 6-foot tall ceiling, and if you jump, you might be able to jump higher than me, maybe even by a few feet, but then compare this to jumping to Jupiter. In the end, it really doesn't matter who's a higher jumper, because in comparison to jumping to Jupiter, we're both terrible jumpers. If the ground represented the depth and depravity of mankind and Jupiter represented perfection, the expectation and definition of good and how high we can jump is a measure of our goodness. Hopefully you're keeping up with me here. Then that means I am not good at all. And then not to mention my previous point that jumping to Jupiter is impossible. And ironically, that's exactly the point. You can't meet the standard. Only Jesus and Jesus alone can meet this standard. This is the point of the gospel. This is why we need him. So back to the main point though, just because people do these good works, this doesn't mean that they're somehow more worthy humans who don't need the gospel. Not only that, in my experience and in my opinion, sometimes this is a deterrent from them seeing their own flaws. Now, I personally know someone who spends half their week doing charity work, boots on the ground stuff with the homeless, listening to people, helping children, and even donating a lot of their money to help others. But they're extremely unkind to their spouse. They have terrible anger issues to the point that a lot of their friends have a hard time being around them for a long amount of time. And what's terrible about it is that they won't lend an ear to those who might correct them. They want to be remembered by the good, not the bad. There's someone who wants to be remembered as giving someone the shirt off their back to help them, because that's what they always say at funerals, right? Everyone is a saint in their casket. They were the nicest, kindest, funniest person that's ever lived, and it's as if any wrong they ever did was absolved. I think that this is the kind of reaction most people want at their funerals, and for the bad stuff to be forgotten. They want to leave a legacy. And sometimes, for them, the work that they do is seen as almost a weapon, an excuse for them to behave the way that they do. You can't tell me anything because look at all the good that I do. Now, sometimes it's not that extreme, but I would say that that is some perspective. I would say that most people would fit in the description I gave before. They reflect God's nature, but then turn around and say that they don't need God to be good. Who knows what's really in their hearts? And some people have the typical belief that if they do more good than bad, then they're set. They're eternally set. They think it's a cancel out game, right? Well, I got drunk and yelled at my kids. But to make up for that, I'm going to donate $500 to charity and spend my weekend volunteering at a homeless shelter. It just simply does not work that way. And people tend to judge a person by their outer works, which might be precisely why some people gravitate to it. Every time that this comes up, every time that this topic gets brought up, I point to one of my favorite parables, the Pharisee and the tax collector in Luke 18, verses 9 through 14. Starting in verse 9, it says, "To some who were confident in their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable." And for the record, I think people hide the fact that they look down on everyone else because everyone wants to look humble. But I digress. Let's keep reading. Verse 10, "Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector." And if you guys don't know much about tax collectors back then in the first century, they were not very liked. They were looked at as very corrupt. Verse 11, "The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, 'God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get.' But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look to the heavens, but beat his breast and said, 'God, have mercy on me, a sinner.'" This is Jesus talking. He said, "I tell you, this man, the tax collector, rather than the other, the Pharisee, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." I think that this is an excellent example of my point. Everybody thinks they're so humble when they do good works. We want to tell God how good we are. And ironically, if someone is going to claim that they do so much good, but then not believe in God at all, their standard of goodness is just an opinion. Objective moral values are rooted in God. God's only holy and perfect good nature gives the absolute standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. See, this is what we do, guys. This is what we do. We compare ourselves to Hitler or the guy who committed a terrible crime. We are so much better than them. But in comparison with God, that is the good, right? God's moral nature is what Plato called good with a capital G. He is the source of moral value, the standard. So for the Christian, our moral duty can be summed up in two great commandments. First, you shall love the Lord your God with all your strength, with all your soul, and with all your heart, and with all your mind. People like to forget that last part. And second, to love your neighbor as yourself. What I find interesting is anyone can do the second command. It's the first that trips people up. So in this light, it's a sort of shortchanged sort of love and charity. And one of the most favorite videos that I've done so far is about this, about God's love versus worldly love, which I will leave in the description below. And I go into way more detail about this if you want to check it out. But one thing I mention is that God is the completion of how to love. And I submit that it's easier to do charity work on a Saturday than to stay pure until you're married, right? It's easier to do these good works than to go against the cultural flow, or to die to yourself and live for Christ. So hopefully that explanation has given you some sort of tangibility to navigate a conversation with them, because you don't need church or God to do good works. You don't need that to be moral, but one thing I like to talk about is the moral law. Everybody knows what's good because it's on their hearts, which points to a creator. And then another thing that I like to do is what Ray Comfort does. I think that Ray does a good job of showing people how good they really think they are. Nobody can get through the 10 Commandments. That's a great way to show God's standard as well.